Greetings, denizens of the Empire. It's Jabara here. Welcome to the next episode of my series on African cities and architecture. In our last episode, we had a general and collective discussion about earthen architecture in its many forms throughout the African continent, as well as the unsuspectingly complex purposes and techniques employed by various groups of African people who utilized it as a building material. Today, however, we will shift our focus to a totally different style of architecture. While the Bamum and Bamileke, among other various Cameroonian people, sometimes built with earth as well, we will be discussing a very distinct and beautiful style of architecture that consists primarily of wood, bamboo, wicker, and thatch. A form of architecture that early European explorers were so impressed by that they refused to believe that they were designed purely from indigenous African ingenuity. Additionally, we will discuss another form of Cameroonian architecture made by the Musgum people that utilizes earthen building materials in an extraordinarily beautiful and unique method. In fact, these structures could easily pass as alien dwellings or homes of goblins in a fantasy game. However, in this presentation, we will be focusing exclusively on the wooden dwellings that were first discussed, and if you would like to learn more about the latter, please head over to Red Spirit Mask's channel. Not only will he be discussing the Musgum architecture, but he also helped immensely with the research that I put into this video as well. I'll leave a link to his channel and his video at the end screen. The Bamileke, Bamum, and Bafia people inhabit the grasslands of what is now northwest Cameroon. Structures of the Cameroonian grasslands generally have walls composed of raffia palm fibers tightly bound together, sometimes interlaced into beautiful patterns or daubed with red laterite clay. Timber beams were then laid across the top of these walls to support a ceiling or a second floor which supported a roof. These roofs typically consisting of steeply pitched thatch which took on an imposing dome shape. European spectators referred to them as saddle roof due to their resemblance in shape. Massive timber beams supported multiple stories and high wooden poles were used as support columns for verandas. In the homes of higher-ranking officials or royalty, these poles would sometimes be carved with intricate designs. Some large sections of the walls were entirely composed of woven raffia cloth, which was more or less the same structurally as basketry or wicker. Simple geometric and animal shapes could sometimes be woven into these designs, such as the case with the King's Palace, which prominently displayed lizards, a strong cultural symbol among the Bamum peoples. The practical application of these raffia walls could possibly have served as a means of allowing airflow into the structure without exposing it too openly to the weather or insects. Wooden friezes could also be found, bearing similar motifs. I just want to briefly shout out Happy Hippo Herbals for making this video possible. Happy Hippo Herbals is a provider of numerous alternative medicine products, some of which I use regularly to help me stay focused and feel less anxious in my daily life. If you use my referral link or referral code FN10, you can receive a 15% discount on all Happy Hippo Herbals products. Go to fromnothing.info/market for my affiliate link and for links to other partners that I've worked with in the past. Location was a very important aspect in the hierarchy of Cameroonian grassland societies. Springs and rivers were found in abundance in the lowlands of the region, and were the preferable location for royal palace grounds, as they were created to resemble fertile gardens. This was because of the reverence of and association with water and underworld deities. In fact, the farther down a hill or valley that a structure was erected, the more important the individuals were who lived there, which totally contradicts most other places, such as the case with the South African kingdom of Mapungubwe, in which the royalty lived atop a plateau while the commoners lived at the bottom. The status of the individuals living within the structures also had a profound influence on how they were constructed. For example, the royal palaces of Bamileke usually had 4 entrances, prominently displaying artistic scenes of animals and humans. Nobles would only have 3 doors, and these would be surrounded by geometric patterns. The lowest ranking Bamileke officials would only have 2 doors with no decorations at all, while commoners would have just one singular, undecorated door. The Bamum were the founders of a sophisticated kingdom that existed from the 14th century all the way up into the 20th century. The Kingdom of Bamum. In 1902, their king, Njoya, willingly submitted to German colonial rule, acknowledging that there were clearly a more powerful polity, and thus avoiding any unnecessary bloodshed that might have ensued from fighting against other colonial authorities. By all accounts, King Njoya even admired the Germans, and surprisingly, the Germans shared the same views on Bamum. Thus, unlike the case with other colonial holdings throughout Africa, a period of mutual respect flourished between the Kingdom of Bamum and the German Empire. German visitors reported that King Njoya was a respectful, intelligent, and humble man. This opinion is highlighted by an unknown visitor to the region in this excerpt, despite the racist undertones that were prevalent during the early 20th century. He is definitively one of the rare Negroes who has a pronounced intellectual independence. Between the years of 1906 and 1916, German visitors documented the wonder and elegance of this African state in the form of many paintings and photographs, most of which depicted the astonishingly sophisticated architecture of the region. Written descriptions and artifacts were also collected during this time, igniting the European imagination to the point of elevating Bamum to an almost mythical status. These structures took all former views of primitive African architecture and unapologetically proved that the black inhabitants had the knowledge, skill, and artistic aptitude to build beautiful, functional, and efficient structures. Traditional structures were composed entirely of wood, bamboo, and woven raffia palm fibers, but later, newer materials like mud brick and stone would later be incorporated. Early German explorers remarked upon the sophistication in many forms of these structures as it challenged what had been previously written and widely accepted by anthropologist George Stelenius. If one does not consider the shelves, platforms, etc. mounted on interiors in the space between roof and wall as a foreshadowing of a second story, then as the majority of cases show, all African houses are built with one story. While this presumptuous viewpoint on African architecture has numerous historical examples to the contrary, the unfortunate reality is that many modern people still believe
them savage Africans didn't know how to build nothing other than one-story cow huts. The white man was building multi-story stone palaces 2,000 years ago.
No, that's a lie. We was building skyscrapers and spaceships and shit, but the white man do nothing but lie and hide the truth. They ain't even know how to wash their own until the Blackamoors taught them how.
Whoa. As I was saying, this erroneous description of one-story African structures written by the aforementioned German anthropologist over a century ago continues to be perpetuated today, due to the overrepresentation of poor, rural, and hut-laden villages depicted in popular culture, and unfortunately willful ignorance are among the culprits of this problem. The neighboring Hausa people to the north of Bamum, for example, featured multi-story structured buildings, and may very well have been the influencers of the practice in Bamum. Once German explorers began documenting these structures during the colonial era, they expressed unconcealed admiration for the architecture of the region, and insisted that these traditions must have been products of European influence. This belief was so strong, in fact, that German artist Marie-Pauline Thorbecke compared them to the colonial homes and assumed that they were a clear example of the abandonment of traditional Bamum architecture, implying that the Kingdom of Bamum was being reduced to nothing more than a mimic state. However, she also had a tendency to contradict herself frequently in her writings.
The house was more beautiful than any other and resembled a house of a white. Yet the king had never seen any of the houses at the time he built this one. The entire design was a product of his own imagination.
King Njoya was even aware of these European attitudes towards his traditional architecture, so much so that he officially claimed intellectual ownership over all of his designs, highlighting that they were purely designed by him and only him. As a result, he thus maintained a prominent reputation as a black African innovator, in stark contrast to the racist viewpoints that held sway in this era. Despite these favorable comparisons to the dwellings of whites, as well as the racist undertones, Thorbecke suggested that the Bamum society, despite its strides to mimic the whites, could never fully absorb European methods of thinking or being. In reality, the kingdom did what every human society does. They preserved their cultural traditions, but they adapted and innovated if the opportunity or ability to do so was available. This is abundantly clear in the uniforms worn by King Njoya's soldiers, which displayed clear evidence of German influence. Even to the present day, all world armies bear prominent European influence, so it is not an isolated instance of mimicry in the case of Bamum. Rather, it's just the natural phenomenon of human innovations and ultimately globalization. Thorbecke, however, provides a questionable contradiction to the argument of mimicry, later attesting to some aspects of the architecture being a product of innate black or African condition.
The way in which the brown wood walls of the upper floor rise out of the white plaster of the stone wall below attests to a natural artistic instinct that the Negro could never ever learn from whites. An instinct that lies in his blood through the inheritance of generations.
This contradiction highlights the tendency for human beings to group things into black or white categories rather than appreciating the gray area, especially when regarding African people. The Bamum state was simply an African kingdom that adopted aspects of foreign cultures as they saw fit, but they were still purely African at their very core, just as the skyline of the city of Tokyo is not considered to be a mimic of New York or Chicago. It is purely Japanese despite borrowed influences from the United States at the turn of the century. In other words, nobody in their right mind would ever call Tokyo a mimic of an American city. Herman Frobenius, however, held a different opinion, stating that the architectural traditions of Bamum were so important to their identity and way of life that upon finding new lands to colonize, they'd readily adopt new building materials, if familiar ones were unavailable, but persistently retain the same architectural traditions in spite of the new location and new materials, and only make minor alterations if necessary. Fumban, the Bamum capital, was described repeatedly in European writings as nothing short of a fairyland, with the key talking points emphasizing the grandeur of its buildings, the size of the city itself, the organization, and the fortifications. This viewpoint was further exacerbated by the relatively recent discovery of the city by European spectators, who had already colonized virtually every other area around it, but had no knowledge of the city of Fumban until the early 20th century. Despite this, Thorbecke still held her persistent views that the city was nothing short of a hybrid between European and African influences, and she pompously stated that the consequence of this is that the people of the grasslands of Cameroon were on the highest cultural level of all the tribes within the grasslands. Further stressing her point about Western influence, she noted that
settlements and house building display the same type seen in the other grassland territories in the Jang and Bamenda district, except that they are constantly more beautiful and resplendent.
Based on her favorable comparisons to European architecture and her implications that Bamum was effectively a mimic state, this viewpoint undoubtedly asserted that the more beautiful and complex structures were only possible from European influence. A viewpoint that clearly contradicted her implications about the ideas stemming from King Njoya's own intellectual ideas. Today, the Palace of Fumban, built in 1917, was constructed in place of the original wooden palace that was burned down. This modern version displays unapologetically European features in both style, technique, and building materials. However, the original structure was much larger, intricate, and in my humble opinion, more beautiful than the current one. Fortunately, we still have photos and paintings of the original palace, and even a map of it drawn by King Njoya himself. Additionally, The text used on this map was written in the Akuaka script, an indigenous writing system that stands among one of the many innovations developed indigenously by King Njoya. If you want to see more beautiful and complex African architecture, be sure to check out the second part of this collaboration on Red Spirit Mask's YouTube channel, where he will talk about another unique style of Cameroonian architecture created by the Musgum people. I'll leave a link to his video down below and on the end screen. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you did, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. For sources, check out my website, linked below. If you'd like to support future projects, you can do so there as well, or by clicking the join button below, or by becoming a patron. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching as usual, and always remember, we don't come from nothing.